I often talk about trust and having trust. And the first element that I want my students to have trust in is themselves.
You're listening to the Happy Doc Student Podcast, a podcast dedicated to providing clarity to the often mysterious doctoral process. Do you feel like you're losing your mind? Let me and my guests show you how to put more joy in your journey and graduate with your sanity, health, and relationships intact. I'm your host, Dr. Heather Frederick, and this is episode 85. And on today's episode, I chat with Dr. Ellen Beattie. Ellen is an educational leader, developer, and consultant specializing in positive academic leadership, online teaching and learning, and neuroscience. Currently, she is an assistant professor and core faculty member in the PhD in Education program at the University of Arizona Global Campus. She also operates an educational consulting platform, the Center for Intentional Learning, where she supports the academic community in neuroscience-based teaching and learning, online faculty and student success, student retention, and educational leadership. In 2020, the Online Learning Consortium recognized Ellen's commitment to diversity and inclusion with the Leadership in Equity and Inclusion in Online Learning Award. And for all you listeners who teach or learn online, you definitely want to check out her recent publication, The Power of the Positive: Enhancing Online Student Engagement for Adult Literacy Learners. And this publication is highlighted in Adult Literacy Education, the International Journal of Literacy, Language, and Numeracy. I know that's a lot of words. I'm going to have all that information in the show notes. Ellen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Heather.
I love doing this podcast because every time I chat with a guest, I learn something new. And that certainly was my experience when you gave a workshop on the literature review. So for the listeners who haven't yet started their dissertation or doctoral project, this is typically chapter 2. It tends to be a part of the process that's very challenging. And as I listened to you talk, I thought, if Ellen could bottle the magic she is sharing right now, she would be a millionaire. So I'm so grateful you agreed to be on today's show.
Well, thank you, Heather. Those are very kind words. So yes, let's start with what chapter 2 is. What is the literature review? And if you look at different definitions, you'll see different people explain it differently. A few that I like is that the literature is going to provide an overview of what the published literature says in the field. It's going to collect key sources on a topic and, importantly, discuss those sources in conversation with each other. Now, a lot of students find chapter 2 to be extremely difficult. And I know with my doctoral students, it's one of the ones that seems to take a lot longer than initially expected. So let's start by talking about what makes the chapter so hard. What unique challenges does chapter 2 have that perhaps some of the other chapters in a dissertation or applied doctoral project might have? Well, first, it requires a deep knowledge of your subject. You simply can't write what you don't deeply know about. So there's a lot of prep work, and we'll talk about some of the steps and the stages that can make the writing process more smooth. But the deep level of knowledge is really one of the things that makes it so complex. The large amount of information means that as a doctoral student, you're going to have a way to organize those sources. You cannot simply keep them in the back of your mind. Or many years ago when I was doing mine, just papers and papers and stacks of articles everywhere. There are definitely ways that you can use technology to make that process better nowadays.
And Ellen, I would love to interject and kind of stop you there for just a moment. You started by talking about this need to have a deep understanding. And I think that's part of the shift that people will talk about moving from classwork to writing the dissertation. In your classes, you may be asked to write a pretty significant research paper. But even if you've got 15 or 20 references, you're still just scratching the surface, and you can do really well on that paper and think, I'm a pretty good academic writer and I'm getting A's going into this dissertation. And then you get to chapter 2 and you almost hit a wall It's a different task than anything you've been asked to do before.
I could not have said it better myself, Heather. I often tell my students that the literature review specifically asks them to go from being a passive observer from the literature to an active creator. That's a big step in someone's academic journey, which kind of speaks back to another reason why it's so hard. The skills of synthesis, of being able to find themes, commonalities, and contradictions in the literature is not an easy task. Those are high-level cognitive skills that are required. And then I think the final thing that I would say of why the chapter is so challenging for everyone is that it's constantly evolving. So at some point in the process of your project, you will write your chapter 2. But as you're writing other chapters and as new work is being published in your field, as new discoveries are happening, you will be expected to include that in your literature review. So truly, until that final document goes for the dean or the provost's signature at the very end, you can consider your literature review to be an evolving document.
And that's another thing that we don't do a lot in the courses. We don't have the time in an 8, 12, 16-week course to revise, add. At most, maybe you're doing it twice. But with the chapter 2, I say the same thing to my students. We're going to write it. We're going to revise it. Dr. Kelly Olson talked about dissertation Jenga. As things evolve, we might move this section over here and move this over here. But just know that up until your oral defense, you're going to still have to be in the literature, knowing what's going on and updating that chapter 2. So it's not like you can write it and kind of lock it down and go, okay, chapter 2 is done. Yeah, you've got an approved draft, but it's not done until the whole thing is done. And that's a new situation too for a lot of people. Now, you talked about the massive amount, just the sheer volume of research you're going to have to go through. That chapter 2 has to show depth, which some people have some experience with in these shorter research papers or even a master's thesis. But you also have to show breadth, right? And so I think that's where that organizational system you were talking about really comes into play.
I also like to think of it as having a strategic plan in place at the beginning. So unlike some of the other chapters in a dissertation or an applied doctoral project, other chapters might have more of a guidance or more of a structure that is outlined in your institution's handbook. Chapter 2, though, is really based on your study and your problem. And there is no one set standard outline of content for a chapter 2. So why don't we talk about some of the steps in the process to getting to the point where we're ready to write a chapter 2? I don't know about you, Heather, but during the pandemic, I was looking for some additional things to do inside my house, especially during the cold mid-Atlantic winters. And one of the things that I started doing was puzzles, jigsaw puzzles, 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzles. So nothing like I'd done in my elementary school years. And I think we can use the jigsaw puzzle as a good analogy for writing literature review. And so as I'm talking through the steps, you'll hear me reference some of these parallels to creating a jigsaw puzzle. And the first one is when you start a jigsaw puzzle, the first thing you do is you open up the box, you take a look at all the pieces, you probably turn them so that they're the right side up, and then you start sorting them. That is one of the first steps of creating a literature review. You are going to be required to gather your sources. Now, these might be books, they might be trade journals, but primarily they're going to be peer-reviewed journal articles. Now, the earlier that you can begin gathering your sources, the better. So for those doctoral students who are in their coursework and they have a good idea of what their topic and their problem is going to be, then this is a perfect time for you to actually start these first initial stages of your literature review right now. Now, certainly not everyone has that fortunate experience of knowing exactly what they want to study from the beginning of their program, but the earlier you can start gathering sources, the better. You are also going to want to make sure that you're gathering sources from all perspectives, not simply the perspective that you hope or think that your study might take. So you will find the key theorists that are the players in that field. You'll find the key researchers who is actively doing the research in the field right now. You can even start some Google searches or some alerts to be set up so that you're alerted when new content is being published in that area. That's a great way to kind of take a passive approach to making sure that you're not missing something that is being published. So once you're gathering your sources, then the next step is, of course, evaluating and starting to organize those sources. So some of your sources are going to align with your topic. Other sources that you come across are not going to be very well aligned with your topic. But we have to remember that the literature review is specific to you and to your study. So anything that you're finding that is not aligned or is not relevant, not timely, those are articles or sources that we really need to be putting aside. We don't necessarily need to discard them completely, but we do need to put them aside. We have to be selective when we're thinking about our literature review. We have to avoid that temptation to include everything. So once you have a core group of your sources, you are going to want to start skimming and scanning them. The best way that I encourage my students to do this is by reading the introduction and the conclusion first. If those things seem well aligned with their study's purpose and research questions, then they can go a little bit further. They can start looking at the research questions, the methodology, the findings. And at that point, they really have a firm idea of whether that will be something that's included when they start writing their literature review.
And Ellen, I want to just say that is a great productivity tip because I know a lot of students feel compelled to read an entire article because that's what they've been doing through their entire academic career. They find an article, they read it. But at this stage, you have to be selective. And so just reading parts of the article to determine whether or not you're going to dig deeper can be a huge time saver.
It is a huge time saver. Now, depending on how wide or narrow your topic and your problem are, you may have an overwhelming number of sources to start looking through. So there's an essential piece to that. We want students to be able to write their literature review and keep moving in their project. We don't want students to get stalled. And two of the ways that students get stalled are being overwhelmed with the sheer number of literature that's available, but also going down those rabbit holes. Reading something, it points you in a different direction, maybe a different keyword, and then the student will go back, start their searching again with these new keywords or these new ideas that they got. And that just leads to rabbit holes and directions that are not well aligned with our study's purpose and research questions.
And Ellen, I was a rabbit holer when I was working on my dissertation. I remember I'd read an article and then I'd go to the reference section and I'd think, now I need to read all these. And that is a strategy for figuring out more, other relevant articles and whatnot. But I kept doing it. I kept saying to myself, 10 more articles. And then, but this one looks so interesting. And what about this? And finally, at some point, my doctoral advisor said, you need to stop. You need to stop. There has to be an end to this because you could get an article, read all the references in that article, and then all the references, and you will be here forever. So for those of you out there where your chair has maybe said, I think it's time to stop and start writing, that's probably good advice. And before we move on, I wanted to go back to something that you said that I thought was really important because we're encouraging people to be selective, to really be discerning so that they don't go down these rabbit holes. But at the same time, you said you're looking for articles that are really having conversations with each other, not just articles that support your viewpoint. So be selective, but be selective in the way that it's focused in your topic area, not that you're just looking for and reviewing articles that support what you think is really happening. You have to be open to both sides or multiple sides of any topic.
That's a fantastic point, Heather, because at some point in the process, maybe multiple points in the process, you will be defending your choices that you've made, whether that's a preliminary oral defense or the oral defense at the very end. Your committee, your chair will ask those questions to ensure that you've gained full, diverse perspectives on your topic.
And let's face it, as an academic community, we love to dialogue. Some people call it critique, criticize, maybe even argue points. But you better believe if there is a group of researchers saying this is how it works, there's probably a group of researchers saying, well, we think it actually works like this. And if you don't cover those kind of controversies, for lack of a better word, those different ways of thinking about your topic, you're going to be asked about it.
That's right. So let's talk about now, what are you going to do? Now that you've skimmed and scanned your articles, now what are you going to do? Well, I'm going to suggest that now would be a great time to start reading and taking notes. Now, this is going to be nothing new to the doctoral learner. They are well-versed in reading and taking notes. But in this case, and we've already touched on this because of the sheer amount of information, the organization of that reading process and the note-taking process is essential. You can use a literature review table, you can use a synthesis matrix, or you can listen to your fantastic podcast on systematic note-taking that was earlier in the series. Anything that you can do, though, to make sure that you're entering into that reading and taking notes process with a systematic plan in place. Once that happens, then I think that you're ready to outline, to organize and outline. And perhaps you're using a concept map situation where you're looking for themes and commonalities. Hopefully your literature review table has allowed you to find some areas of synthesis. And we will certainly talk about synthesis because that's another element that seems to hold students back from a high level of success in their literature review. But I really like the outline process. And I like to, if we're going to go back to our analogy about the puzzle, I think the outline is when we've created the sorting of the pieces and we have the pieces that are inside pieces and we have the pieces that have straight lines. So the outline is really us taking those straight line pieces and creating the border so that we can see the picture of what the literature review is really going to shape up to look like structure-wise.
And Ellen, with an outline, is that something that you ask your students to do before they start writing? Because I know some students just want to jump in and start writing. And I have learned to say, can I see an outline first? Because sometimes when they just jump in, they end up going down these bunny trails and there's a lot more revision that has to happen.
I agree, Heather. I think that the outline is probably one of the most important parts. And I know that students sometimes get frustrated because we've talked about a lot of steps in the process, but we haven't talked about writing anything, right? This balance between researching and writing is an important one. But at this point, we've talked about 3 or 4 steps, none of which really, other than note-taking, includes any academic writing. So I think students want to get to that point where they want to start having a deliverable in hand. But the more time spent in anticipation of the writing, the more smooth that process is going to be. So let's talk about the outline for a second. The outline can be super valuable for a lot of different purposes. Number one, it allows you to start integrating and transforming those ideas. Because remember I said earlier, you are moving from being a passive observer of the literature to being an active creator. And what that means is that you must maintain your own academic voice as you're writing this chapter. So integrating and finding how those ideas kind of sequence together is an important part of the outline. And you can move and adjust the places to make sure that there's a logical flow. So how those ideas are sequenced is another really important part of the outline. And then finally, it creates a roadmap for the writing. Now, I've seen students who really like to start at the very beginning of the outline and write all the way through. I have other students who wake up in the morning and feel compelled to write a certain section that day. Whatever is going to help you be more productive is what I encourage them to do. But you want to have a roadmap from the very beginning. That roadmap, if we're looking back at our puzzle analogy, is like that image that we can see on the front of the box, right? That is allowing us to have a vision of what that final literature review is going to look like. Referring back to that often helps us to make sure that we're not getting off track.
These are, again, not just words of wisdom, but great productivity tips, because you would not build a house without blueprints. You'd probably make a lot of mistakes, and it would probably take you 5, 6, 7 times as long. I don't know. I've never built a house. But I can tell you, I've worked with a lot of doctoral students, and the ones who have an outline absolutely finish faster than those who don't. And I also love that you gave people the freedom to, hey, write what section's calling to you today, right? That's a productivity hack, because if you're forcing yourself to write the next section, but your head isn't there and you really want to write this other section, go write that and come back to the other one. So I love that you encourage students to kind of meet themselves where they are when they do sit down to write.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So now I think we're actually to the point where we are going to write. We have our detailed outline. We've shared that with our chair. We've gotten some feedback on that. And now our chair says, get ready to write. So that's a daunting process in and of itself. Probably one of the first steps that you're going to take as a doctoral student is rereading and reviewing those matrix that you created. You are going to definitely, if you have not yet done it, focus on the synthesis component of the literature review. We talk about the literature review being one of these elements where you have to maintain your own academic voice. So the worst drafts of literature reviews, and I think you might agree, are author 1 said this, author 2 said this, author 3 said this, and it becomes a book report. Without the student's academic voice being interjected into the content, it really is nothing more than just a list of who said what.
And those will always get returned, guys. And your chair may say, this is a book report, or this can't just be a string of like an annotated bibliography. And again, that's that shift between in a course where you may be asked to demonstrate that you've consumed this content and you understand it, versus what you said, you're creating content now. So we need to see that you can weave those pieces into a puzzle that's unique to the story you're telling, right? And show what I call, and I wish there was an easy way to show students this besides giving them well-written work, but I'll say, everything that you've written is true, I get it, but I don't see doctoral level thinking here. You're not articulating doctoral level thinking here, and that's what we need to see as part of this demonstration project, and that's where that synthesis comes in.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I've also heard synthesis being described as, let's say you're at an academic conference on your topic or on your problem area, and you accidentally walk into the lounge that's for the keynote speakers and for the invited speakers or the panel speakers. What kinds of conversations are they having? Where are they finding agreement? Where are their academic opinions conflicting? Where can those commonalities be found? Those are some ways for a student to think about, how can I synthesize? How can I add value to what's already been written? So this idea of thinking about the authors as chatting with each other in an informal way, and what are they saying? Where is their conversation going? So as we mentioned, of course, your literature review, as you're writing, must cover the full scope. It's giving a background, right? It's giving a story to your proposed research. At the end of reading your chapter 2, your audience should have a pretty firm understanding of where the field sits in respect to your research problem and your research questions. And that's another key point, that we always have to be doing that synthesis with a keen attention to our own study. A few other tips as you're writing your literature review. Remember that you are now the authority figure. You are establishing yourself as an expert in the field. So we do need to make sure that we're critiquing rather than simply reporting, and that we're bringing meaning to the content. As we maintain our academic voice, we need to focus on the relatedness of the concepts that we're sharing. And we do that by internalizing the themes and the trends and the gaps that we're seeing in the literature.
And Ellen, this idea of being an expert, sometimes I've worked with students where they want me to tell them what to do or what to write or how to make sense of these things. And I find myself saying, well, but hang on, you're the one who read all the articles. This may be related to my field, but you're the one who just did the deep dive with, everything from the historic background and the foundation to the most contemporary research. And it's time for you now to step into that role as the expert, because we actually want to hear what you have to say about it. Versus in classes, it may be, the instructor the professor professing all their knowledge and the students just soaking it up. And now the tables have turned a little bit. And as faculty, we're saying, we recognize you as the expert and we want to hear your voice. And sometimes I think, again, going back to that shift, why is it that some students say, but I sailed through my classes and I get to the dissertation or the applied doctoral project and I just feel stuck? It's because now we're saying, okay, you're ready. It's time to step up to the plate and tell us what you make of this conversation. What is the story you want to tell?
That's a fantastic point, Heather. I often talk about trust and having trust. And the first element that I want my students to have trust in is themselves, their expertise, their instincts. If they've been studying their topic and their research problems for a year, 2 years, maybe even longer than that, they have some instincts that are going to tell them the direction that they should go, whether something should or should not be included in that literature review. And I want my students to understand that their professors and their programs have created a situation where they can be successful. They have been prepared for this challenge. And yes, it is something that they've never been asked to do before, certainly on this scale. But I want my students to know that they need to trust themselves, that they have been well prepared for this challenge. The other thing that I tell them is to be trusting of the process. There is a reason why doctoral students do not enter into academic research all by themselves. They have a chair and committee members who are there to support them. That part of the process is key, right? The congeniality that happens between chairs and students is really important to the final product. So that's another disposition that if a student is looking to prepare themselves well for that kind of challenge for the literature review, they can practice that congeniality, accepting feedback, asking for feedback, seeking it out, and then being able to implement that well into their writing process. But yes, being able to trust yourself that you've been well prepared, trust your expertise, and also to trust the process will go a long way in helping a student find success.
This concept of trust is so important. And while you were talking about that, you said something that I don't want to slip through the cracks. And you said something like, well, once you've been reading and studying in your area for a year, 2 years, maybe 3, you'll be able to trust yourself and you will be the expert, and chapter 2 will start making much more sense to you. And I just want to kind of have everyone pause on that and realize if you're struggling with your chapter 2 and you haven't been steeped in your literature for some time, don't expect that you're going to be the expert. I have students who want to give up and I say, but you changed your topic area towards the very end and you've only been doing research in this area for 3 months. How would you expect? You just need more time. There's no substitute for time. You need more time in the literature.
That deep understanding of what the literature says is critically important. You simply can't summarize or synthesize information that you don't know very well.
Such an important point. So, Ellen, do you have more tips and tricks, or is it time for you to share your favorite quote or some final words of wisdom?
Well, I have one more tip that I think that is really vital. I know it was vital for me, and I think it's vital for the students that I work with, and I'd love to share it with your audience. And that is to try your best to stay sane through this process. Going in with the right expectations, realizing that you will do far more reading and thinking than you will writing is important. But knowing when you are doing your best work, knowing if you wake up early in the morning and that's when you're at your cognitive best, scheduling those blocks of time. I think we've heard these resources talking about writing a dissertation in 10 to 15 minutes a day. I've never seen that actually work. Right? There is no substitute for time, just as you mentioned. Knowing when to take a break. Sometimes the best thing that we can do for ourselves is to walk away, to close our laptop and to go take a walk out in nature. It's that same idea of the great ideas that we get in the shower in the morning when we're not thinking actively about them. We can have some really great insight when we step away from our work. So remember that your mental and emotional health is a really important part of this process. So go for a walk, prioritize your nutrition, your exercise routine, most importantly, your sleep, but try to stay sane, because if you're not taking care of yourself in those ways, it will be difficult to be at our cognitive best.
And Ellen, that is such an important point that many of the guests bring up. We are asking you to do something that requires a lot of mental capacity. And if you're stressed, if you're tired, if your body's not getting the nutrition it needs, if your relationships are a mess, it's going to be really difficult for you to think at the high level that you absolutely have to think at to do this project. So trust your intuition when it's telling you to take that walk in nature, or my favorite, take a nap, right? Trust yourself there too.
Right. So if I had one mantra that would really align really well with the literature review, it's this: better today than yesterday. I live my life by that saying. It really speaks to this idea of continuous improvement and lifelong learning, but it also emphasizes the positivity and the hope for a better tomorrow. So thank you so much, Heather, for having me. Thank you so much for bringing all of this academic content and insights to our doctoral community. I can't tell you how many times I share your podcast episodes with my students, and I always get resounding positive feedback from those shares. So thank you very much.
Oh, well, that's so great to hear. And thank you for participating in this episode that is going to be, I'm sure, one of the most listened to episodes, because my guess is that students will listen to this over and over again, and faculty will get such great tips. And I wanted to let everyone know I will have ways to connect with Ellen in the show notes, and I will also have links to the systematic note-taking podcast you talked about with Dr. Jen Robinson in the show notes below as well. So thanks again, and it was such a pleasure chatting with you today. Thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to connecting with you on the next episode. Until then, if you're looking for more ways to invite joy into your journey, check out the free resources at expandyourhappy.com. You'll find downloads like an article I wrote titled The Doctoral Journey, 12 Things You Need to Know That They Probably Won't Tell You, and a worksheet that will help you pick a general research area for your dissertation or doctoral project. Based on audience request, there is a PDF that organizes all podcasts by the 7 steps detailed in the Happy Doc Student Handbook, which you can also find on the website. And if you're looking for Happy Doc Student swag, I've got that too. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and YouTube channel, and if you want to make my day, rate and review so that together we can change the way graduate education is delivered and experienced. Hey, one more thing. Just a quick reminder that the information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only.